Welcome back, everyone. For those of you that joined us last week on our Facebook Live, we talked about the research that we have done with female leaders and continue to do with female leaders, as well as what we've learned from these female leaders about what's made them successful in leadership, and have identified 7 core themes. This week, we are talking about the most significant theme called self-advocacy. Now, before we begin, again, I just want to say there are so many barriers to women being successful in the workplace and women ascending into leadership in the workplace. And I don't want to oversimplify a very complex issue of why women don't succeed in the workplace at the same rates as men. I'm just merely pointing to some of the things that we're learning related to leadership skills that we can strengthen as female leaders to help us better navigate and succeed in the workplace. It's also important to, again, say, this isn't just about navigating in the existing male-dominated environment of the workplace. It's also simultaneously working to dismantle systems of oppression and bias in the workplace as well. But we have to do both things at the same time. And so this is really aimed at things that we specifically have individual control over, that we can do for ourselves to better navigate the existing environment, while we're simultaneously working on dismantling some of the barriers that we encounter as women. When we talk about self-advocacy, what was really interesting to us is that it was the most significant theme that we saw in the conversations we had with female leaders, where every single woman we talked to pointed to some sort of self-advocacy that they had gotten really good at as a female leader. And what we found is that this theme popped up everywhere, in lots of different places, but in every single conversation we had with female leaders. And I think that's the most important and critical thing to point out, is that, this really is the most significant theme. What we see is that we aren't great at it as women, and in fact, it sometimes feels like a dirty word. There are women who are great at it. And in fact, there were lots of women we talked to who were really great at self-advocacy. And some of us have been conditioned from a really young age to be great at it, to speak up for ourselves, to advocate for ourselves, to say when we're uncomfortable, or to confront problems. And so much of self-advocacy is really based on a couple of things. It's based on how we were raised, how we were socialized, how we were educated, how we were, brought up in the world, and some of the cultural and even organizational barriers that we may or may not have encountered as women throughout our lives. And so those things play a really important role in the way we perceive self-advocacy, and the way we actualize self-advocacy, and the way self-advocacy shows up for each of us as women. Some of these women we talked to were really innately good at it, but I would posit to say that maybe that was a part of their socialization. Maybe it was a part of the culture that they grew up in. Maybe it was a part of the way that they were raised, and that those things contributed to maybe their seemingly innate ability to advocate for themselves better than others. I think this also, what brings into play and what shines a brighter light on this is, because so much of the way we look at self-advocacy and whether we are good at it from a young age or not really brings into play this idea of intersectionality, that the intersection of race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and socioeconomic status and physical or mental impairments and all of these historically marginalized identities intersected with gender play a big role in how we look at and see self-advocacy. When we start to pull out interviews from women that have an intersection of non-white female or non-straight female, the way they look at self-advocacy changes a little bit. And so it's not really consistent as we look at the gender in totality. And so I think that's important to say that, it really has a lot to do with socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all of these things intersected with gender. So I know some of us were taught to speak up at an early age, and we saw that. But some of us, and in fact, probably a lot of us, were sort of conditioned and socialized in what we call this sort of good girl culture, where we were taught as young girls to be good, to sit down, to be quiet, to be kind, to don't argue, to be helpful, to be mothering and nurturing. And as a result, self-advocacy feels negative to us. It feels boastful, it feels selfish. And honestly, when we see it in other women, we disproportionately judge it negatively. And, women are disproportionately negatively impacted when we do advocate for ourselves, for raises or for promotions or for more money, or when we negotiate contracts, that we are judged differently than maybe our male counterparts. And I think some of that socialization that we experience as young women, particularly in American society, has sort of set us up to be really, really bad at advocating for ourselves, but really, really good at advocating for other people. Where I talk to a lot of young women and a lot of female leaders who are great at advocating for their children and advocating for their families and advocating for their friends and their colleagues and their direct reports. That's something that's very innately something they do really, really well. But advocating for ourselves may not be something that is as innate or as natural to us, and maybe doesn't feel as good as advocating for other people. And as I was preparing for this today and really thinking about that piece of it in particular, I started to reflect on the places in my career and in my experience as a female leader, maybe where I leaned on advocating for others and didn't do a great job of advocating for myself. And it's sort of like that reflection kind of slapped me in the face. This whole series of Ladies Leading was really about giving women voices and giving their stories voices and advocating for these great female leaders and their experiences and to shine light on those things. But I haven't done that for myself. And I haven't talked about my experiences in the same way that we've asked these other female leaders to do. And so, even me, who's sitting here talking to you all about self advocacy, I also suck at it. So, we are socialized to not be great at this stuff. And so, this is a system we have to learn to override. This is a script that we have to start flipping. And so when we talk about self-advocacy, all of these female leaders that we talked to talked about how important it was to advocate for themselves and how important that played a significant role in their success and their progression as female leaders. And if we want to continue to do that in our own experiences, whether in life or in our careers, we have to start to learn to override some of that socialization and natural programming that we've experienced as women through our upbringing and through culture and through our education. And so that's what self-advocacy first and foremost is really about, is that we've got to learn to be able to advocate for ourselves with the same sort of fervor and enthusiasm that we often advocate for others. And, for many of us, that's seen really negatively. We perceive it really negatively. And so we avoid those experiences at all cost. But if we truly want to thrive in the workplaces and in our lives, we have to do a better job of it for ourselves. Now, when we look at advocacy, it's not really just about advocating for a better job or advocating for more pay or advocating for a promotion or advocating for better opportunities at work. It's so much more than just sort of advocating for upgrades or more money. Advocating for yourself also looks like navigating conflict successfully when there is conflict, because that's a part of, we're peacekeepers, we like harmony, and we're navigating this communication minefield as women. And so sometimes we avoid conflict and we acquiesce in places that maybe we shouldn't be acquiescing. And so, really looking at how we navigate conflict, but also standing up for ourselves when we are confronted with bias or discrimination or mistreatment, whether it be in the workplace or in a volunteer capacity or in our lives or at home or even in our families and relationships, advocating for when we experience mistreatment and saying, hey, I'm not okay with this. What was really interesting to me is one of the female leaders that I talked to, one of the things, Carolyn Mosby, for those of you that have watched the series, Carolyn is this powerhouse woman that I think is like one of the coolest ladies I've ever met in my whole life. And she scares me. And also I admire her so much. But one of the things she talked about was sort of this idea of advocating for herself in this capacity of really letting people understand what she is willing to tolerate in terms of the way people treat her and what she's not willing to tolerate, and really doing a good job of advocating for herself in those regards. And so I think a lot of us maybe acquiesce, or we put up with too much from people, or we let it roll off our back too often. And as a result, don't do a great job of advocating for ourselves. But when that behavior is done to someone we love or we care about, or that is a direct report to us, we're like ready to go to war with them. We're like ready to box it out. And so, again, we've got to override this system of where we're taught it's okay to advocate that fervently for someone else, but it is not okay to advocate that fervently for ourselves. The other piece that I think is really important about self-advocacy is really balance. And that's the piece for me that I think is the missing link. So many people say work-life balance doesn't exist. It's a myth. You can't have balance. And in some regards, I do agree with that statement. But in many regards, I think finding balance and finding sort of a place where you feel good about where you're putting your attention in your life is so much about self-advocacy. But again, because as women, we're taught to support others and stand up for others and advocate for others, we often get out of balance because we're so focused on helping other people that we forget what we need as individuals. And so, that's self-advocacy sort of encompasses this big bucket of stuff that I want to make sure we don't miss that, because there's so much in there that I think is so important around self-advocacy that I want to make sure that we hit it. Now, when we look at self-advocacy, let's dig into this stuff, right? Let's dig into how we better self-advocate, how we work on overriding this system. And the reality is that self-advocacy is about three things. It's about understanding your ambitions, understanding your priorities, and understanding your boundaries. Those three things, when we understand what they are, allow us to advocate for ourselves more effectively. Now, that doesn't allow us to advocate for others more effectively, but it absolutely allows us to advocate for ourselves more effectively. So let's talk about ambitions. Ambitions are, what we want for our lives, what we want for our careers, what we want for our futures, and really understanding what those things are so that we can set priorities and we can set boundaries around those things. And so that we know what we should be advocating for at work, at home, with our partners, in our relationships, with our friends, in our families. Those things allow us to better understand where we should put the emphasis on advocacy and what really matters to advocate for and what is okay to acquiesce on. And so it's really about understanding, what do you really want for your career? What do you really want for your life? And that is a constant process of evaluation. That is a constant process of reflection and introspection, which we are going to talk about next week when we talk about self-awareness, because that is the really big piece of the other really significant theme in our female leaders is self-awareness and doing that action of introspection. But, just to give you sort of a personal insight, when I graduated graduate school, my only ambition in life was to be a university president. That was my goal. I graduated from a master's program in higher education administration. I knew that in order to be a university president, I was probably going to have to get a PhD eventually or an MBA. I was probably going to have to work in higher education for a little while, but I was also probably going to have to work in business, and probably business that either works in education or works education adjacent, or maybe do some public service in government. And so I had all these ambitions about wanting to be a university president. And so every priority, every boundary, everything I chased was focused on that ambition, which meant family really wasn't a priority. Having kids really wasn't a priority. Being in a relationship with someone really wasn't a priority for me. And I chased these career goals aggressively. And then I met my husband. And those priorities and those ambitions and those boundaries changed a little bit. And then after we were married for a while, I wanted kids. And then I had kids. And then all of a sudden things start to evolve for us. And as those things change, your ambitions change. And as those ambitions change, where you place priority changes. And as those priorities change, how you build boundaries changes. And so, first and foremost, we have to go through this sort of constant evaluation of what our ambitions really are so that we can choose where to advocate for ourselves. For so much of my 30s and even my late 20s, my ambitions were be successful businesswoman, build a career that's going to allow me to position myself to be a university president. And that was so much of what I wanted early on. And somewhere along the line, those ambitions changed, and those priorities changed, and those boundaries changed. And I'm in a totally different place now. And I think that's important to say first and foremost. Advocacy is about understanding and evaluating regularly what your ambitions are. Once we know what our ambitions are, we can start to build priorities. So I recommend that at any point in time, you have 3 to 5 priorities that you've set for yourself. Things that you are totally focused on and that are the most critical and most important things for you to work on over the next 3 to 12 months. I go through this practice about every quarter where I set sort of these priorities for myself, and they change. They change based on what my ambitions are. They change based on the things that I want for my life and the things that I want for my career. And so those priorities evolve. You know, when I had children, all of a sudden, my priorities were less about positioning myself in the community and in the higher education community as a leader and a thought leader, and more about being present for my family, and more about building a network and a reputation locally in my community and not just sort of nationally in this higher education environment. And so those priorities started to shift for me. And so all of a sudden, when it was about networking nationally with higher education professionals and positioning myself as a thought leader in education, my focus was really get connected in Indianapolis, build relationships with business owners and leaders in my city, find an opportunity that allows me to travel less and be home more regularly, to be a mom and to be a partner to my husband. And so those priorities start to shift. 6 months ago, one of my priorities was start giving back to my community in some way. And so I started to prioritize that thing and look for ways for me to get more engaged, look for ways for me to prioritize being engaged as a volunteer in my community. And so once we set ambitions, we can start to set priorities, but priorities change a little bit more frequently than maybe our ambitions do. And so, you know, those things evolve over time. This sort of comes from this concept of the big rocks. So some of you may have heard this story of the big rocks or have done a big rocks exercise before, you know, where they had this professor take a big jar and he put a bunch of rocks in it and he asked the class, is this jar full? And the class is like, yeah, it's pretty much full. And then he takes a bunch of pea gravel and dumps it in, and it fills all the little holes. And he says, now is this jar full? And they say, yeah, it's full. And then he takes a cup of sand and he pours it in, and it fills all the other cracks around the pea gravel and the big rocks. And he says, okay, now is this jar full? And the class is like, yes, for crying out loud, the jar's full. And then he picks up a cup of water and he dumps it into the jar, and it fills every possible space left. And he says, now is this jar full? And the class said, yes, the jar is full. We get it. And he asked the class, so class, what was the point? And some kid in the back of the room raises his hand and says, there's always room for more crap. And the professor chuckled and said, true, but not really the point. The point he was trying to make is we have to fill our bucket with our big rocks first, the things that are most important, our key priorities. And we have to make sure that we stay laser focused on the big rocks in our lives. Otherwise, if we fill our lives up with pea gravel and sand and water, or the things that don't matter as much to us, the things that really do matter don't necessarily have as much time or attention as we'd really like them to. And so that's really where this concept of priorities and setting essentially 3 to 5 priorities, what that really means is, what are the things that are most important to me and that I can keep as my keystone to come back to and say, this is the stuff. And when I'm looking to say yes or no to an opportunity, or yes or no to something to do, or yes or no to another engagement, whether volunteer, or yes or no to another kid, I always go back to these keystones and say, what does this decision tell me? What does this question I have? What is this opportunity I have? What do my keystones tell me I should do? Do they line up with these keystones? Do they help me achieve these things? And if they don't, the answer is probably no. If they don't, they're probably pea gravel right now. They might grow into a big rock someday, but right now they're not. And so they're really a way for us to stay centered on the things that are most important to us. The last thing is boundaries. And this is the thing that I'm terrible at. I'm terrible at saying no. I'm terrible at setting boundaries, but I've worked really, really hard to be better at them. And boundaries, I think, are the way that we find better balance in our lives. And they're also the way that we prioritize the things that are most important to us. By saying to people, here are the hard fence posts that I put around certain things in my life. Here are the hard fence posts that are my boundaries. And they're the things that my do not cross lines, my sort of electric fences that tell me what I say yes to and what I say no to. And the important part about boundaries is the minute you let someone take advantage of or cross one of your hard boundary lines, the minute it no longer becomes a boundary. That boundary disappears the minute that you let somebody cross it. And so, one of the things that I did when I moved to my new job at the Center for Leadership Excellence is I started to say, listen, I've got 2 young children. I'm gone all day at work. I have this tiny little window that I get to see them every day until they go to bed from the time I get home from work. And so from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., I don't do work. I don't take calls. I don't do meetings if I can absolutely help it. And that this is sort of this hard fence post. I don't check my email. I don't engage in that way, in that really hard line that I've set around this one place I want to have as a boundary. But that boundary is only important because one of my priorities is to be present on a daily basis for my family and for my children, and to be a mom that is active and engaged in my children's lives. And so that boundary directly correlates to a priority that I've set for myself. You may have kids and, don't set that boundary. And that doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't make you a bad mom or dad. That just means that you have different priorities than I do. And I think that's what's really important. But those boundaries allow me to advocate for myself as well, to say, yeah, you know what? I can't take that meeting at 1 o'clock. I pick my daughter up from school at 1:30, and it's really important for me to do that. So we can meet from 1 to 1:30 until I need to leave to go get her, or we can meet at 2 when I get home. And I've said that to clients before. I've even been in the middle of like a sentence with a client, and my alarm that goes off at 1:28 to remind me to not go to get my daughter from school goes off in the middle of the meeting, and I say, "I'm sorry, I have to go. Like I have to leave to go get my child from school. If you need anything else from me, please pop me an email, or we can pick up the phone and talk after I get back." And that's a hard boundary that I've set. I love picking my daughter up from school. I love walking her to school every morning. And I've blocked that stuff off on my calendar because it's really important to me to be that constant for her in her at the beginning and end of her day. And so that's a priority for me to be a present mom. And so I set those hard boundaries around my life. Those boundaries may not be related to your family or to your partner at all. Those boundaries may be about working out. You know, I once did a program for a company, and I had a woman say to me, you know, I try to work out on my lunch hour, and what I'm finding is that people will try and schedule meetings during the lunch hour, even though I have my workout on my calendar, and they keep scheduling meetings during the lunch hour. And I said, well, are you accepting those meetings during the lunch hour? And she's like, well, yeah, most of the time I just sort of say yes and then I don't work out. That's why people keep scheduling meetings in your lunch hour over your workout, because you accept them. The minute we draw the hard line and the minute we say, no, this is a boundary, is the minute that people stop abusing it. And the minute people start understanding where those hard lines are. Those boundaries may be related to the way people treat us, the way people talk to us. You know, when I talked to Carolyn Mosby, she shared a story about, you know, someone who got really short with her on the phone. And the minute that call was over, she jumped on the phone with him and was like, like, we can disagree and we can have a debate about things, but you don't get to treat me that way. And she set a hard line. And because she set that hard line and didn't allow the abuse to occur, those things didn't happen as much or any longer. I don't know the answer to that. So, but those things stop occurring. And so those boundaries can be related to a number of different things, but they are all related to the way we advocate for ourselves, what we allow and what we do not allow, what we accept and acquiesce on, and what we do not accept and what we do not let roll off our back. And so when we look at advocacy, we look in those three buckets. What's really important, though, is that that's work we have to do every day, because that's a system that has been ingrained in us as women, to let it go, to be kind, to not make a fuss, to sit down and be quiet. And advocating for ourselves is taking a risk. And we as women are conditioned to not take risks. We're going to talk about risk taking as well during the Courage Lunch and Learn. So make sure to tune into that one too. But we're taught like not to do those things. And so self-advocacy is this constant system we have to continue to override, that we walk away and we think about what happened and what we could have done differently. I have a young woman that I talk to regularly that I just think the world of. And she texted me the other day and she said, today I had to say something difficult. And I looked down and I played with the hem of my jeans while saying it. Right afterwards, I thought Jess Gendron would be so disappointed. I'm sorry. And I chuckled at her, and she said it sort of tongue in cheek to me, but I said awareness to our habits is really the first step. And then evaluating what we can do differently, and then leaning into those things as they happen. Not every one of us has the ability to sort of confront our boss when they're mean to us. Not every one of us has the ability to say, I'm not taking meetings from 5 to 8 p.m. Not every one of us has the ability to say, I'm working out during lunch, or any of those things. And so you have to really look at what you are able to do and the places where you are advocating for yourself or have the opportunity to advocate for yourself, and what we can do about that. So there's a little taste for you all about self-advocacy. Next week, we'll be talking about self-awareness and introspection. What's interesting about self-awareness is that there's a study that recently came out about self-awareness. And these researchers asked people, are you self-aware? And 85% of the people that responded said, yes, I'm self-aware. And their research actually found that only about 10 to 15% of them actually were self-aware. And that happens because we're really doing introspection and self-evaluation incorrectly. And so that's one of the things that we will talk about next week on the self-awareness segment. Last thing I wanted to share with you all is we've had lots of women wanting to learn more and really enrich these 7 competencies in themselves. And so today we are launching registration for what we are calling the Ladies Leading Masterclass. It's an 8-month course that we will do entirely virtually that's open to any woman who wants to strengthen these competencies in herself. You can learn more at ladies-leading.com/masterclass, or just simply going to ladies-leading.com, and there's a graphic on the homepage you can click to learn more.